Voting is something that many of us take for granted. It's as natural as renewing a driver's license or opening a bank account. But this isn't true across the spectrum of citizens in our state. Here today, in the midst of the fall 2016 election, is Theresa Tran to talk about her work with API Vote Michigan. Theresa, welcome to Feel Like You Belong.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you are a second-generation Vietnamese American, which means your parents came here as immigrants. Can you tell me a little bit about their story?
Sure. So my parents actually came here both as refugees, which I think is a little bit of a different story from some other immigrants. But both of my parents came from Vietnam, both from southern Vietnam. My father actually came first in 1975. He had never met my mother. They met here in Michigan. But he came on in 1975, and his story is particularly interesting because he was on the second to last American cargo flight out before the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975. So he was very fortunate to be able to get out. My mother, on the other hand, didn't come to the United States until 1979, and she came as a boat person. So similar to what you see with a lot of refugees today who are making really challenging journeys
across the Mediterranean.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's really dangerous and scary. But my mom eventually made it here. They both eventually made it here to Michigan.
Did they both go to refugee camps in the Philippines?
My dad went to, not a refugee camp in the Philippines, but he went to an American base, a military base, and stayed there for a little bit. My mother, on the other hand, stayed for a month in a refugee camp in Indonesia before she got to the United States.
Okay. And then they eventually met in Michigan.
They did, yeah. They both met and fell in love, I guess, in Michigan. They both had sisters here who were friends, and at a family party or at a community party and gathering, they met one another, and I guess the rest is history. The magic happened, yeah. And here I am today.
And here you are today. And you have brothers and sisters?
I do. So I'm one of 5.
Okay.
Part of being in a Vietnamese family, but also a Catholic family, lots of children. So I'm very fortunate to have had 4 wonderful siblings who are just, we love each other a lot.
Okay. Now, you mentioned being Catholic. What percentage of Vietnam, or at least South Vietnamese, have been Catholic?
About half of the population is Catholic, and so that's why even here in the United States, you see a lot of Vietnamese communities organized around places of faith. So either the Catholic Church or Buddhist temples.
Buddhist temple, sure. And Catholics because of the French colonialists?
The French influence.
Earlier in the previous century. So, okay. So your parents came here fairly young, but still English was their second language. Did they talk at all about struggles in the early days?
Yeah, they both did. My mom was very fortunate, so she took English as a second language classes. It's funny, I found a picture of her with her ESL teacher, and at the time, when I was in middle school, I said, oh my gosh, that's my world languages teacher. So her ESL teacher ended up being my world languages teacher, and so I think that really speaks to the importance of having community and being in a place where you feel like you belong and you feel like you have the support of people who might not look like you, but really want to see your success. So we're very fortunate in that way. But I think both of my parents still struggle with English, and they, even to this day, feel not very confident about their ability to speak English. So they choose when they're in public to be very quiet, especially when they're among people who aren't Vietnamese. But both of my parents are very chatty people, and they'll say a lot of things in Vietnamese.
At the Vietnamese parties?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So your current function, in the introduction we talked about, this is an election year, and you are working for APIA Vote Michigan.
Yes.
So tell us about the organization.
Yeah, so APIA Vote Michigan, APIA is an acronym for Asian and Pacific Islander Americans. So it's sort of this huge umbrella of Asian American communities. And as you may or may not know, it's a very diverse group of people, unlike the Latino community, which can generally organize around a similar language.
Well, they have Spanish in common.
Yeah, we don't. We don't have that at all. We have very different languages where people don't understand. Cambodia might be right next door to Vietnam, but there is very little, no similarity actually.
Linguistically very
different. And so the work that we do is really around organizing Asian American communities to understand, first of all, how to register to vote. We still remain one of the lowest registered racial demographics in the state of Michigan and in the country. So we are really trying our best to make sure that our community members, that we're going to them to get them registered, because it is very simple, but many people just don't know how. They're just not familiar with the system. The second thing we really try to do is educate people about what happens when you go to the polls. It can be very intimidating, not just for immigrants, but for first-time voters, young people, if they've never been exposed to, like, where's the line, where do you go, what do you need to bring with you?
Am I doing this right?
Yeah, it can be very intimidating. Sure. So we want to make sure that we give our community members the tools that they need to feel comfortable when they enter in the polls, and then they also know their rights when they go there. As I said, it could be a very intimidating experience, and sometimes people who might be working at the polls who aren't familiar with different cultures and how they operate can sometimes intimidate voters. And we want to make sure that our community knows what their rights are when they go to the polls, and that they have the right to assistance in bringing people into the polls with them if they need language assistance to help translate the ballot, or that they can vote absentee if they need that additional assistance to vote at home. So we want to make sure people know that.
I think that's worthy of clarification, because for all of us who are native born, we just automatically registered, went to vote in English. What does the law say about language access?
So there is a federal law, and it's Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, and that specifically says that once a community reaches a particular threshold of limited English proficient voters, that jurisdiction has to provide in-language assistance. So everything that you see in English, including poll workers who speak English, has to be also provided in that other language. In the state of Michigan, Asian Americans are still very small, but there is one jurisdiction where they are federally required to provide everything in an Asian language, and that's Bangla in Hamtramck specifically.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So how small or how large are those individual districts? Is it like one polling group, like a ward or a?
It's usually determined by the city, and so that's where it can be really challenging. So in, like we see in a place like the city of Detroit, there is a burgeoning Bangladeshi community, but it's in a very small part of the city, and they wouldn't reach the population threshold in a way that would trigger that federal law.
Okay.
But in a place like Hamtramck, which is like 2.2 square miles.
It's a small city.
It's a small city, so it makes it a lot easier to be able to trigger that.
Give that, yeah. Can you talk about the comfort that gives people who have to do that in a second language, in a second culture?
In terms of the ballot translation?
Yeah, access to things like voting in their first language.
Well, I think when English is not your first language, and as someone who knows English fairly well, there are things that show up on that ballot where in English, and I'm like, I have no idea what this means.
These legal expressions.
Yeah, lots of legal expressions, and they're written in very tricky ways to mean one thing. When you read it, it actually means something else to you. So being able to take the time and not feel the pressure of other people in line behind you, or wanting to feel like you're doing the right thing and being a good citizen and moving through quickly, taking that time to be able to review and understand ballot initiatives, understand candidates in your language, I think it just helps people feel more comfortable. And so one of the things that we also provide is voter guides in language. So we focus on, unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to translate it into every Asian language, but we do focus on some of the top languages where we know that there is a high level of limited English proficiency.
What are those languages?
So it is Bangladeshi, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese have some of the highest rates of limited English proficiency in our state.
Okay, awesome, awesome. So what is your current challenge with API Vote?
I think one of the hardest things for us is that Asian Americans are still feel as though the political process is not something that we should participate in.
They don't feel they belong. I mean, because they're citizens.
Yeah, in some ways you'd believe, and we see a lot of there are parts of the community where they become naturalized and then they're really excited to vote. We also see people who become naturalized and they say, oh, but we didn't know where to register, so we were really excited but didn't know where to go. So that's part of it, just having the knowledge of where to go to register. The other thing is we also have a lot of ethnic communities for whom they come from a country where democracy is not the primary, form of government,
Sure.
right? So voting is not something that comes naturally in terms of their culture.
And maybe the government's a little bit to be feared.
Absolutely, and in some respects, yeah. If you vote if you're from a country where you vote for the wrong person, there's a lot of election intimidation and things like that. So there's just kind of this internalized belief that maybe voting isn't something I should do, or it's not something that is normal. So what we really try to do is send home the message that as a citizen, it's your civic duty to vote because your voice counts. And not just in the presidential election, but in every election, right? Every ballot initiative. So it's not just important to vote for who's your president, but everything down the ballot.
So what's the range of your activities for your organization?
For 2016, oh, so many.
So you were talking about voter registration, for example.
Yeah. So we are working to register over 1,000 new Asian Americans to vote. So we have until October 11th, which is the voter registration deadline.
So our viewers should take note.
Yes, it is very important to make sure you're registered. Either if you've moved or have never been registered before, you need to make sure you register. And we have a link on our website at apiavotemi.org where people can click on and get the voter registration form and pre-fill it out and print it and send it. So that's a resource that anybody, no matter whether you're Asian or not, can utilize to get registered. So that's a big thing. And what we're doing is, like I said before, because people don't automatically know where to go, we go to the people. So we're going to churches, temples, mosques. We are going to grocery stores where we know Asian Americans are going to show up and buy their groceries. We have
people got to eat.
Yeah, absolutely. We have campus liaisons on different college and university campuses. I'm going to Grand Valley State University to register voters because we want to make sure that we're hitting as many demographics as possible.
Sure.
So we do voter registration. We send out mailers because the other thing that we know or that we have found out is that political parties, ballot initiatives are not sending information to our community about voting. Yeah. So there's a whole way of figuring out numbers and things like that, but a lot of people want to focus on turning out the highest likely voters. And unfortunately, because our community isn't voting regularly, we don't tend to be a target for a lot of people. So we're really working to change that to make sure that we are talking to our community members and getting them to turn out to vote so that we start changing that. So we're sending mailers, we're doing phone calls, and we're trying to send some things in language as well. One of the things that is a new initiative for us that we haven't done before is we're going to be sending in-language mailers to certain ethnic communities, particularly targeting seniors, to get them on the permanent absentee ballot list.
Great idea.
Right? So that so transportation doesn't have to be an issue. It gets mailed to them automatically every year.
You can take your time.
Yep, and they can take their time, they can work with their family members. We've done some workshops at senior centers and heard from seniors that, their kids tell them, oh, you don't have to worry about it. You don't need a ride to the polls, but they really want to vote. So we want to make it easy for them and make it easy on their kids who can't take the time out to drive them to the polls on election day.
Sure.
And then finally, in addition to voter mobilization, we also do voter education. So we'll have some candidate forums where people can come out and hear from local candidates about
so
their
opposing
platforms.
candidates.
Yep,
Okay,
we'll
wonderful.
invite them.
Wonderful.
And then on election day, we actually do exit polling and voter protection work. So we go to polls where we know that there are going to be a lot of Asian American voters, and then we survey them to find out what are their attitudes about voting, because if you look at any of these national polls, it is really difficult to find anything about Asian American attitudes. And so we work with a national organization to help push that information out, and then work at the polls on election day to make sure that Asian Americans aren't being our votes aren't being suppressed in any way. We have seen.
Is there a history of intimidation or suppression?
Yeah, we actually, and I won't name the polling location, but back in 2014 here nope, I wasn't supposed to say that. So I won't mention the polling location, but in 2014, we worked with at a polling location and was just observing, and we knew that there were going to be a lot of limited English proficient voters there, and we saw that because none of the poll workers could speak that language, they were frustrated when communicating with these voters, that we saw voters being held to the side for up to 4 hours. Voters whose ballots were spoiled and no one could explain to them why, and they were so frustrated that they just gave up and walked out. We've seen in other parts of the country where, because there were so many limited English proficient voters, that they've created separate lines for them to go through versus others.
In a discriminatory way or a helpful way, like we'll put extra language help in this special line for you?
They weren't putting extra language help in that line. It was because they felt like those particular voters, and then they were profiling them, putting them in a separate line, assuming that they were going to slow down the rest of the lines.
Got it. Got it. Okay. We have to wrap up in just a moment, but two last quick questions. What kind of help do you need in the next month? Do you need volunteers?
Yeah, absolutely. We are always looking for volunteers because it is not an easy feat to be going out and registering lots of voters, be educating voters, going to knock on doors of people's homes to tell them about everything, and working on election day to make sure that we're surveying people and protecting their vote. So we're always looking for volunteers, and it's a very simple way to sign up on our website.
We'll put your contact information on the screen for people to see. So last question. The theme of our show is belonging. What creates belonging in your mind?
For me, I think that it's not just about acknowledging or tolerating someone new, right? Someone who might be different from you, but it's actually incorporating them into the fabric of the community. And that means making sure that people are a part of decision-making processes, that you start to see people who are elected, who look like you, or who are appointed to different things that look like you. And I think that helps to make people feel like they belong, because there's someone who's like them, who understands some of their history, and incorporates that into the way they make decisions in their communities.
I believe in the next month there's going to be a woman recognized in Detroit at a celebration. Stephanie Chang?
Stephanie Chang, yeah. State Representative Stephanie Chang, who is actually one of our founders of our organization, and has been someone who's been really supportive of our work and of our community. She's the first Asian American woman elected to our state legislature, so we're really proud of her.
I was thinking of Sam Singh too.
Yes, Sam Singh and Senator Hoon-Yung.
Yeah, absolutely, good guy too. But and if you see yourself represented, then this is a great point. Then you feel like you belong as part of the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. We're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank you for driving into Grand Rapids today and telling us your story.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You bet.
And the Interpreter A are fully certified interpreters with 10 or 15 plus years of experience as in the interpretation field. They usually are those simultaneous interpreters that you see in events that handle the equipment. They also do court interpretation.